Welcome to Inside the Bible, produced here at Andrews University. I'm joined today by my friends, Felicia Dattis and Andrew Abbott.
So look around. Do you have your smartphone with you, your laptop, or whatever device that you use to connect? But you also need your Bible. And join us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/InsideTheBible. Send in your questions, your thoughts about the program, and don't forget to ask your family members and your friends to tune in and join us on this journey.
In the last episode, we got introduced to one of the most important religious characters in world history and how he was called to a mission impossible.
As we discovered, it would have been really hard for Abram to leave his family, his friends, his home, and the familiarity and safety of his society in order to follow God wherever he would lead him. But if we think that this was the most difficult part, we are wrong. These events just compose the last few verses of chapter 11 of Genesis and the first 9 or so verses of chapter 12. The Bible contains 13 more chapters about this remarkable man and the challenges he faced after he left his home.
So how does Abraham's adventure unfold throughout this book? What about the promises and the challenges that he experienced? Why is Abraham's story so important for the rest of the Old Testament?
These are awesome questions, and we're going to see the answers for them. Join us because the investigation starts right now. What does it mean for you to make a covenant with God? What does that mean to you?
It's agreeing with God and saying, here I am, I don't know how to do something, and I believe through your power we can accomplish something together.
I think a covenant with God would be a covenant along human terms with anyone. Just saying you're committed to whatever it is that you and God have come to terms with. I think it's important for me to know who the God is that I serve and realize that with that serving, he has all these expectations and things that when I chose him, I agreed to follow through with and kind of pursue. And so I think that covenant just means a continual pursual of what it is God's, wanting me to do in my life and how he can work in that.
One of the most important elements of Abraham's story for the rest of the Bible is the part where he makes a covenant with God. But what is a covenant? And why was it so important? Andrew and Robert sat down with some theologians to discuss about this covenant in Abraham's life and the relevance his story might have for us today.
Let's talk about the covenant now that God is making with Abraham. It takes several steps along the way, and it's a very interesting story. What do you make of it?
I find it interesting that God takes this liar, this guy who is completely imperfect, but yet God takes him and he makes the covenant with him. He doesn't say, I'm going to wait for you till you're perfect or anything. I'm going to wait to see the characteristics in you. He just says, I'll make the covenant with you. So I find that quite interesting.
And the covenant where he takes Abraham out and he has him look at the stars and he says your descendants will be like the stars of the sky. That's one promise that no one can debate came to pass. Because you have the entire nation of Judaism, you have Christians consider themselves spiritual children of Abraham, and all of the Islamic nations, they all count themselves as the members of those stars of the sky, the descendants of Abraham.
I would say safely there's billions, in the billions.
For sure.
That is a lot of.
That's amazing.
People, so.
Yeah, and I think about that relationship too, because God really came to Abraham with a really high-stakes promise when he made this covenant. I mean, you think about that tradition where a promise isn't just something flippantly, I'll meet you down at the store, I'll meet you down the street, and then, it come 15 minutes later or something like that. A promise is where they're staking it on their character and they're going to follow through no matter what. I mean, they literally sawed animals in half and walked between them saying, I'm going to fulfill this, or you can do that to me, basically.
And for them, like you were saying, a promise is absolutely your word. I mean, there's nothing else. If you go back on your word, you're no longer, it's different in our society today. Absolutely different.
Abraham is a very important turning point in the narrative of Genesis. You begin Genesis after the fall of Adam. You see how the humanity goes downward. There is sin, there is adultery, there is murder, there's a lot of problems, and God finally needs to destroy the world through a flood. Then God begins again with Noah and his family, but then after Noah and his family, we see that again humanity goes in a downward path through the fall of through the Tower of Babel, which was in fact a rebellion against God. And then God brings the division of tongues and the dispersion of humanity. Then God calls Abraham in order to bless humanity. Abraham is a turning point. Abraham is called to be a helper of God's purposes for the world. And the covenant that God makes with Abraham is that God is going to use the family, the descendants, the seed of Abraham, in order to bless all the families of the earth. So you see, the original relationship between God and Adam, that was a relationship of confidence, of love, of trust between God and humans, God wanted to reproduce that through Abraham's seed.
And then her son will be our son. And that's probably the way God's going to fulfill the promise.
Ishmael had 12 sons, kind of analogous to the 12 sons that Jacob had as well, the 12 tribes of Ishmael. Patience seems to be a common theme in the Old Testament. We see this trait appear as early as Genesis 3, where God promises Adam and Eve that He will send a rescuer who will someday break the power of sin and death. And God gives Abraham an amazing promise as well. Waiting is often difficult, especially when the stakes of the expected event are very high. And for Abraham, he desperately wanted a son who could inherit the promises and blessings of his family. And unfortunately, this desperation led to some rash decisions.
That God gave a promise to Abraham, and the promise was that he was going to be the father of many nations through Sarah, his wife. Now, Abraham had an episode before in which he tried to look for an alternative venue, also counseled by his own wife, and says, there's a common practice here in our families, as you know it, that the sons of our slave are our sons. Now, I can't bear a child, Abraham. Why don't you come, lay down with my slave, Hagar, and then her son will be our son. And that's probably the way God's going to fulfill the promise, because I can't bear a child. You're really old, and you're being so old, even if she becomes pregnant, that will be a miracle as well. So he goes to an alternative venue, and then it ends up being a disaster.
I'm here in the library, and we have another exciting piece of information that we're going to plop down into the story of Abraham today. And this time, we're looking specifically at the story of Ishmael. And it's interesting how this whole story starts out, because originally, Sarah comes up with the plan for Abraham to go into Hagar, her handmaid, and Hagar is the one she wants to bear the heir for her and Abraham. And this is a cultural thing back then. But things start going downhill very quickly following that. The family dynamics just fall apart. Hagar starts thinking that she is on a par with Sarah. Sarah lashes back by punishing her. And right after that, Hagar flees into the wilderness after she's had this confrontation, this punishment that Sarah's been heaping upon her for her perceived arrogance. And it's at that point where she meets the angel of the Lord with a message from God for her at this time, saying, Hagar, you will be the mother of a son. You will name him Ishmael. This is a divine name that God is giving to this son. And his descendants will be as numerous as the stars of heaven. A promise very similar to the one given to Abraham and the one that was promised to Isaac in Genesis. And those circumstances are significant because it turns out that even though things got stickier along the way, even though when Ishmael was born, he was originally considered the heir, but then Isaac came along, then there was a confrontation between those two sides of the family. God was still working behind the scenes in bringing about not only a great result for Isaac and for the Israelite nation that would come from his bloodline later on, but also in the case of Ishmael as well. And we could see as history panned out following that there were definitely many nations that proceeded from Ishmael's bloodline. In fact, this is really cool. Ishmael had 12 sons, kind of analogous to the 12 sons that Jacob had as well, the 12 tribes of Ishmael. And when we look at the genealogies, the traditional Arab genealogies that we have today, there are two main characters in this story, Kedar and Nebaioth, who were the two main sons of Ishmael, through whose bloodline many of the Arabian nations that we see today came from. So it's interesting, even though God saw that this wasn't his original plan, even though he saw that this was a plan that was a deviation from what he originally intended, and there was wrongdoing on both sides, there was misunderstanding, there were problems, God was still working in that situation to bring about a result that brought glory to his name. Ishmael is not plan A.
Yeah.
We get that impression
Yeah,
at least. So in the midst of that covenant promise, what were some of the steps that happened along in the life of Ishmael and Isaac that furthered that promise and actually saw the realization of that covenant?
As you know, there is 3 covenants in the Bible that are made with Abraham. And I would say 3 passages. The first passage that we have is Genesis 12. And it's the promise that he will provide a land to him. He will be have many children, and he will have like the descendant. So the concept at the end, he has some problem. He has some doubt, and at that point he realized maybe God is not going to fulfill the promise.
So there's doubt coming into the picture
he
here,
found a way. A way. Maybe God is using another way. It's not a miracle. It can be natural. So that's why he decided to talk with Hagar and have a son with him, with her. But later on, we know that the covenant was also include Sarah, because God said, "Okay, where is Sarah?" He's asking about Sarah, and then at that point he realized. He said, "She's the one. She's the one. It's not you, Abraham, that is going to have the son. It's she that is going to have it."
Then eventually Sarah conceived Isaac. And now Abraham is sure that he is the son of the promise, because it involved him and involved Sarah. So much that if you think about it, that Abraham was not necessarily monogamous by choice. I mean, everybody in the ancient Near East have several wives. It was common practice, and it was not considered to be wrong or adultery. I mean, you think about other patriarchs who, you think about Jacob, you think about other biblical characters who have several wives, and they're never accused of being adulterers, because they were following traditionally common practices in the ancient Near East, which still, by the way, is the case today as well.
Maybe Abraham said, "Okay, God, this is the way that today we behave. That's our culture way. So probably you are using culture to fulfill your promise." And God said, "No, I'm not going to use culture. I'm going to use my power." And I believe that today we do the same thing. We want to use culture to put God like in a box. And because of that, we show faith in our surrounding, not in God's power.
Abraham, after Sarah conceived Isaac, Abraham never gets involved with another woman not until after Sarah died. Then after Sarah died, the Bible tells us that Abraham had many concubines. But why not before? Seems to me that the reason why he doesn't do it before is precisely because the promise is going to be through Sarah and only Sarah. So he's trying to avoid any other deviation from God's plan.
And then God tells him, well, now that you've got Isaac, go and kill him.
God is telling him, if you believe me enough, if you love me enough, if you really think I am God, are you even willing to sacrifice the same promise that I made to you?
If you thought your life was dramatic, experience Abraham's life. He really had some tough choices to make, some really exciting experiences. We can learn a lot from Abraham, stepping out in faith, not knowing where the journey is going to take us, but trusting that God knows what is best and He knows where He's leading us to. What about us? Do we have the power to do the same thing? To give to God something that we hold dear to us? What challenges in your life have helped you to build your connection with God?
Challenges in my life would be probably financial as well. Financial as well as spiritual challenges. I knew that if I didn't come to Andrews, my faith would be a little bit shaky because I would have gone to any other university.
You know, probably even most recently just coming here to seminary, that was, you know, stepping away from a church that I was happy at, transitioning into a life with less money, less opportunities and things, and having to do schoolwork and that kind of stuff.
When I was in academy, I would go canvassing on Sundays, and so for me, I had to rely on God a lot for knowing what the people's specific needs were, because I'd meet like people I never met before, so I'd have to like pray that like God would help me know what books to show them or what to say in order to get them what they needed.
I'm coming from Namibia, which is in southern Africa, but once you're here, you have to, you know, figure out stuff on your own, and you tend to rely on God a lot more than you would when you were younger.
We think of Abraham as an incredible example of a man of faith, but we must not forget that he was also a human being like you and me. Doubts, love for his children, struggles with neighbors and governments, the uncertainty of life, all were a very real part of his experience, just as it is for us. Abraham's spiritual journey was one of growth over time, buoyed by experiences, some good, some bad. A person doesn't often reach spiritual maturity instantaneously. Abraham was no different, and there was one more experience that would challenge his faith in the promise of God.
Now let's move on to our final topic, and that's the challenges that Abraham faced. What are some of those challenges that you can think of Abraham faced, and how did he face them?
Yeah, I mean, the big one is just how he's dealing with this covenant that God has made with him. I mean, God's told him, your descendants are going to be like the sands of the sea, the stars of the sky, and he has no children, for one thing. So there's a big like biological hurdle he's got to get past here. Yeah. And you know, eventually, of course, Isaac is born, and Ishmael, and all that comes to pass. And then God tells him, well, now that you've got Isaac, go and kill him. So
another big challenge.
You know, sacrifice him to me. And to put this again into the context of Abraham's mind, he's coming from Ur, where child sacrifice was the norm.
Yeah, it's common.
And so now he's got this God who's asking for the same thing that the gods he left behind is asking him for. And so this is like this big this big moment for him. He's like, is this God? It's like my biggest fear of who this God is, I have to face it.
It's interesting that you say that, you know, because for me, when I read scripture early on, from Genesis 10 to, let's say, 27, I'm seeing this fragile guy who struggles with faith and doubt. Okay. But yet that's not what the picture that Hebrews says. Paul painted in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews says that Abraham had the faith enough in God that if he sacrificed his son, he would resurrect him back to life. I mean, and it goes back again to knowing this God. He must have known something about God.
Well, he even says, wait here to
Yeah.
the service. We will go to do what?
Right.
We'll go to worship.
That's right.
And we will return.
That's right.
Wow.
So he
That's huge.
must have known.
He
That's
must know
incredible.
something.
I mean, what he has is he has God telling him to sacrifice Isaac, and he has God telling him, I will make of you a great nation. It says some way he's going to make both of these work.
Why was Abraham sacrificing? Well, think about it. First, the practice of sacrificing your own son. It was a practice that was abhorrent for God. Then second, you have the issue that God gave a promise to Abraham, and the promise was that he was going to be the father of many nations through Sarah, his wife. So God is telling him, if you believe me enough, if you love me enough, if you really think I am God, are you even willing to sacrifice the same promise that I made to you? And in addition to that, you can imagine the dilemma that Abraham had by having to kill his own son.
Abram would have had to have decided in his own mind what his God, what Yahweh was really like. Was God really asking him to sacrifice his own son? And I think that is a challenge that the youth today have to decide. What is God really like? Is my God capricious, or is my God asking me to do something different?
God's purposes for the world through Abraham could be accomplished only through Abraham's trust, confidence, faith. And Abraham didn't show faith, confidence in his life. From the very beginning, you see that Abraham sometimes lies, sometimes does not trust in God, finds other ways in which to do things that were not done properly. That these things showed that he lacked confidence. It is until Abraham goes to Mount Moriah and he is willing to sacrifice his son, Isaac, that God says, I know now, I understand, I see that you have confidence. And then he confirms the promise. And this covenant between God and Abraham is confirmed through an oath that God is going to bless the nations through his son. And Isaac is just a symbol of the son of Abraham, which is Jesus. In Galatians 3, we'd say that Jesus is the seed of Abraham, through whom God blesses the whole humanity. So Abraham is a turning point in the history of humanity itself.
Our problem today sometimes, I think, is we like to debate a lot. We like to interpret a lot. We like to discuss a lot. But we are very little when it comes to following what God says. Am I willing to trust God completely? Am I willing to follow what He says, regardless of what it means to me? Am I willing to trust God even above His own promises, above my own conceptions, above my own comfort zone? Am I willing to trust God? And am I willing to follow exactly what He says?
I can't imagine receiving such a message from God and then having the faith to trust and obey.
Abraham's story teaches us some key points about faith in God. Patience is an important expression of our trust in God. God's timing may not always make sense to us, but learning to wait on Him instead of jumping ahead with our own agendas will keep us on track. Abraham received an amazing promise from God, a pledge that he would father the nations. But he found out that this promise from God rested on God's power, not on his own strength.
Remember, you can be a part of this exciting journey by connecting with us on Facebook. facebook.com/Inside the Bible. Also, invite your family and your friends to join us on this journey.
Abraham made mistakes, but he definitely made the right choice in the biggest challenge of his entire life. However, as the pages turn in the Bible, we quickly come across another great historical patriarch, one that failed God and his family and had to run for his life, leaving him lonely and feeling abandoned. I bet there is someone watching right now who can identify with this sort of story. So how can God take someone in that situation and turn it into a positive? Join us in our next episode in our search for answers as we go inside the Bible.
His story starts by him being classified as a liar.
Wow, this is like the home of God. This is the house of God, and I feel comfortable here.
Have you ever wrestled with God?
I would say I'm wrestling with God right now.
He was a follower of God, but this is where he goes to becoming a patriarch.
Once you come to the face of God, there's no other outcome possible.